Hey everybody, thanks for checking out the channel. In a recent video, I did a teardown of the Proline Pro-Comp Scaler Shock and explained how significant it was that a big brand released a negative spring shock, and I stand behind that. Drivers have been looking for ways to keep their chassis low on steep climbs, and we're talking 60 to 70 degree climbs. No other vehicle can do that except RC crawlers. So it stands to reason that some novel technology should be employed. Many drivers have resorted to external rubber bands and hair bands on the outside of their shocks. And I'm excited to see manufacturers have finally taken note of this hack and started to address it in a more sophisticated manner. But building and selling negative spring shocks is just the beginning. Next comes the tuning, and it's a lot trickier than you might think. But don't be afraid, I'm going to break it down for you. On this channel, we look at the science behind our grown-up toys. Before we get into how these internal negative springs interact, I want to add two more observations about the Proline shocks. Some of you asked about the actual shock stroke, which I was meaning to measure, so here it is. So let's just take some measurements here. Holding the shock all the way out. Say it's about 97 eye to eye. And I need to hold it out, so let me get a piece of string here. Just going to clamp this string in my vise so I can get an accurate measurement of when it's fully extended. It's about 24.5 minus half of the bump stop. So the bump stop's about 4.5. It'll compress down to maybe 2.5, best case. And you certainly can remove the bump stop if you wanted that tiny bit of extra travel. So that's a 97 millimeter shock, which is actually what they started publishing online. The set I bought actually came in the wrong box with the long shock length. It has 22 millimeters of travel, which is roughly in the middle between Deluxe DriveTech short and medium-sized shocks. Secondly, I was a little perplexed by the floating washer that holds the seal stack in place. However, at least one of you suggested there could be a flange on the inside, and you were absolutely correct. So there is a flange on the inside here that keeps the seal stack in place. So when this is screwed in, that flange holds the white washer, which presses against this, which is different from what I thought. And one of you viewers pointed this out. So when it's put together, it is captured really nicely in there, and that seal stack's not floating around like I thought at first, which I thought was weird at first, but this makes a lot more sense. Now the spring does fit through that flange, but this white flange here is going to stop against that stop. The spring does still push against the white washer, but the white washer isn't floating in there. The white washer does stop against that flange. First of all, I highly recommend you watch my spring rate versus preload video so you understand what spring forces look like when they're plotted on a chart. Secondly, it'll be helpful to understand what happens when you put two springs together. In this case, a compression spring and an extension spring. This is a concept that really confuses a lot of people, even many engineers I know, and I explain that concept in this video. Today's video should support my claims about the two-spring system, but we'll have to measure it and see. Fair warning, this video is going to get us deep into the nerd weeds, which is why most of you come here, but hang in there may be some surprises at the end. Quick overview. When you combine two springs, it doesn't matter if they are compression or extension, or one of each, there are only two possible ways they can add together, series or parallel. They either get stiffer or they get softer and equal a new third spring rate. Many people think that two springs that oppose each other create a softer spring, and intuitively I can kind of see why that makes sense. You have one spring pushing in this direction. If you add a second spring pushing in this direction, it makes sense that they should be softer, right? Well, this shock will demonstrate if that's correct or not. Here is a quick overview on how springs work. Springs can be combined in two primary ways: parallel and series. Parallel is when two springs are compressed simultaneously but independently, and their spring rates are added together, making for a stiffer spring. Springs in series is when two springs are compressed simultaneously but stacked together. Think of it as pushing a spring that's sitting on a trampoline. When you push on the spring, it also pushes on the trampoline, so you have two springs deflecting or giving way, which makes the response softer than each spring on its own. The equation is the inverses of the rates added together. Now let's look at how spring rate, or spring stiffness, can be represented by a graph. As the shock and spring compresses, the force pushing on the shock goes up. This is a traditionally sprung vehicle. Full extension or top out on the left and fully compressed on the right. In this case, we are looking at a 10 gram per millimeter spring. 10 grams of force for every millimeter compressed. Now, it's uncommon but not incorrect to use grams as a unit of force. It's technically a unit of mass, but as long as we're on Earth, 1 gram of mass puts out 1 gram of force towards the center of the Earth due to gravity. I like to use grams because I have an idea what a gram feels like. To be 100% technically correct, you should annotate this with a G-F for gram force. You would do the same with pound force and ounce force if you want. When you compress the spring fully, say that this is 20 millimeters of shock stroke. That's 20 times 10 grams per millimeter, the spring rate, which equals 200 grams of force at bottom out. The slope of this line is called the spring rate, or the spring constant, or just K. Slope is calculated by rise over run. You might remember this from junior high algebra. This is the rise, and this distance is the run. This is also known as Hooke's law. If you have a higher spring rate or a stiffer spring, the slope of the line changes. It will be steeper on the chart. For example, in this case, a spring rate of 15 grams per millimeter would equal 300 grams at bottom out. 20 millimeters of compression times 15 is 300. This stiffer spring has a steeper slope. Let's take a quick look at preload. Preload means adding force to the spring by compressing the spring, but the shock does not change length, only the spring does. Here's what a preloaded spring looks like on a chart. The stiffness of the spring, or the slope, stays the same. The line simply shifts up or down with more or less preload. Let's say you add 50 grams of preload to the orange line. It shifts up by 50 grams. What this does is shift the position of the piston in the travel, and hence your ride height. The ride height will drop from 50% droop down to 25% droop. I'm rounding a little bit just to keep it simple. This is the only thing that happens when you preload. It changes your ride height, but the stiffness of the spring stays the same. Here are the two metrics side by side. Just to summarize, spring rate changes the slope, the steepness of the line, and preload creates a shift in the line without changing the slope. Now, we are used to looking at the shock spring response like this. The spring compresses, but in the case of a negative spring shock, that will work in reverse. So the chart is reversed. The start of the measurement is when the shock is fully compressed, which is incorrectly called full droop in RC crawlers, and the end of the stroke is when the shock is completely extended. I'll use negative numbers to indicate negative travel. The shock can be set up to have some positive bump travel, and that's how Proline comes out of the box. That positive travel would look like this on the chart if we were to plot it. At the sag point, or the neutral shock position, where the two opposing springs are in equilibrium, this would be your ride height. You have some travel in both the positive direction and the negative direction. The chart starts to get a little convoluted, so to keep things simple, let's just look at the negative travel of the stroke. And you can certainly set the shock up to look like this if you put all the springs on the same side of the piston. I took measurements from the actual shock, and this is what they look like. So you may have seen this test fixture before. I used it for measuring quite a few other things. What I did is I took the shock apart and What we've got is this 2-spring system, and I've put it in a clear tube just so we can see what's going on exactly on the inside. And there's a couple spacers on the inside, but this inside length from here to here is identical to what this is when it's compressed inside the shock. So the internal stroke is identical to what we have here. You can see that there is quite a bit of preload on this shock, compressing both springs when you assemble it. So that gives you some forward and negative travel, and the springs are preloaded against each other. So what I'm going to do is use this force gauge to make some measurements against the spring force. Now what's interesting is you can see that right about this point here, this spring goes slack and it's no longer in play. So you're going from 2 springs to a 1-spring system. And here we only have the effect of the 1 spring, and here we have the effect of the 2 springs. So we should be able to see that transition in the data. So how I'm going to do this is set it to grams, just because grams of force I feel is a number that's easy to understand. Technically, newtons is a number that you'll see more commonly, but who knows what a newton is? A newton is about 1/4 pound of force, but I just use kilograms for this experiment. And what I'm going to do is have this really great block set that has all different dimensions of spacers. And what I'm going to do is start with this almost zeroed. Let's see, right about there. And then what I'll do is zero the force. And then I'm going to take a reading every 1 millimeter. So I'm just going to add a 1 millimeter shim. Then I'll replace that with a 2 millimeter shim. Take a reading, 3 millimeters. Replace it with a 4 millimeter. Replace that with a 5 millimeter. And I'm going to keep doing that all the way down to the full travel. That will give us a force reading at every 1 millimeter increment along the compression of the shock. I'm going to do this multiple times off camera, average the data so we have a good, solid data set. I started with this test run just to see if the setup was working and things were looking right. Now, if I may digress for a moment, take a look at this area here, especially this point. It seems a little out of place. The data is not that consistent here in the middle. This is one of my coworkers, Alex. He's the human on the left. He and I have healthy debates all the time on whether or not you can disregard certain data points. I say you can disregard outliers, as they are called, if you have a good engineering rationale. Alex believes you can never discard data points just because you don't like them. They all have to be accounted for. When I look at this chart, I know it's going to be a straight line because that's how springs act. They are very linear. Or possibly 2 different straight lines since there are 2 springs inside acting at different points in the travel. There are a couple data points here that I don't like. I'm not sure which one can be discarded. In fact, this entire middle section where the 2 springs start to separate look a little fuzzy to me. So perhaps I measured it incorrectly, twisted the gauge, sneezed, there was an earthquake, any number of reasons. Most likely my measuring setup was not super consistent, so I actually went back and improved the setup. So it had less friction and a little less binding, and here's what I got. I would be inclined to get rid of maybe this one data point, but I'm just going to do the whole thing over because this whole middle section looks a little bit suspect. I did 2 more trials, A and B, orange and blue, and they look fairly consistent. You can start to see a trend. There's a steep slope at the beginning and a flatter slope at the end of the stroke. Notice that the slopes of the original test run are about the same. But something janky happened in the middle of the measurements. So let's eliminate the trial run altogether and focus on the better trials after I improved the setup. Here you can clearly see that there's a steep section at the beginning and a flatter section at the end and a sharp transition right about 6 millimeters where the shorter spring goes slack and disengages when it's no longer touching or pushing against the longer spring. So I'm going to split the data up so we can look at the beginning of the travel, where the springs were in contact, and the end of the stroke, where the shorter spring has gone slack. We'll call this a two-spring phase and a single spring phase, because only one spring is in action at the end of the stroke. The short spring is just sitting there minding its own business. Remember, this is the compressed state of the shock on this end, and when the shock is fully extended, your wheels are fully dropped away from the chassis. With a good spreadsheet, you can add what's called a trend line. These trend lines attempt to fit your data to a more perfect mathematical representation. Springs are generally linear, so I know that a straight line will pass through these points, that would be the correct mathematical model. And any deviations, like this point here, simply come from errors in my ability to accurately measure. We can also look at a statistical metric called R-squared that quantifies the quality of the trend line, how well it fits the data. An R-squared value of 1 means a perfect fit. This value of 0.999 and 0.99 here indicate that these trend lines are very accurately fit to the data. The next part we want to look at is the slope of the lines. Again, if you remember from junior high algebra, this term in the equation is the slope of the line, the rise over run. Let's do a quick double check. Here we have a run of approximately 4 and a rise of about 280, let's say. If you divide that, you get 70. So yeah, 62 is in the ballpark. This is a more exact number of the slope. Roughly, the first half of the shock travel is almost twice as stiff as the last half of the shock extension. There is this abrupt change in the spring rate, which will directly translate into the rate that your axles feel when your axles are dropping. Your wheels will start to drop with this high spring force of 62, then it suddenly drops to only 36 and fall out to the bottom of the travel. To check our work, I'm going to measure each of the springs individually and add them together to see if our slope numbers correspond. I'm also going to measure each of the springs individually so we can cross-reference what we find with the combined system. So I'm just going to take a spring right here, and because the springs are largely very linear, I only need to take 2 data points to define a line, but I'll probably take 3 just to be safe. Let me preload this just a little bit. So I've got a little bit of preload here. Hopefully the spring won't shoot out. We'll zero that, and I'm going to give it 5 millimeters of preload. 5 millimeters gives us 160 grams. I'll take a second reading. Now the spring is kind of twisted, so this is a little bit inaccurate. So maybe what I'll do is, instead of taking a 5 and a 10, maybe I'll take a 3 and a 6. You can never have too many data points. All right, so at 3, got 95. This data point's a little bit sus. 191. All right, so that should give us the spring rate for this long spring. I'm going to measure it a couple more times off camera. This is the yellow medium spring. So this is the shorter spring. And I'll probably just do 2 and 4, see how that goes. All right, so at 2 millimeters, it's 60 grams. And at 4 millimeters, we've got 120. And that's exactly to be expected. Twice the compression is twice the force. Makes sense. Now mathematically, we can add these 2 springs together, and it should be pretty close to what we measured when we did the combined spring system in the assembled shock. But let's verify. If you don't have a force gauge and a fixture, and you want to know your spring rate, and you have a set of calipers, you can estimate the spring rate pretty closely by taking just a couple measurements of the spring, and I made a nice spreadsheet for you right here that you can figure out any spring rate of any spring that you might need to know. Now, let's compare the spring rates when I measured the springs separately outside of the shock. Springs in parallel is the correct equation, though you might still think two springs pushing against each other have to be softer. Think of it this way. You have to push on one spring and pull on the other, which makes them act in parallel. So the parallel equation will be the appropriate one to use. The longer spring is represented in orange, and the shorter spring is in gray. I do this just so the colors correspond with the colors on the chart. The blue number represents the result of the two springs combined, and the orange section is just the main longer spring when the short one goes slack. There's no gray section because the short spring is never living alone without the orange spring pressing against it. The chart only has the blue two-spring system and the orange single-spring system. So I put all those measurements into a spreadsheet, plotted them, and got these answers. The orange spring alone measured 32 grams per millimeter. The short spring alone measured 30 grams per millimeter. Add these together using the parallel formula and you get 62. A spring rate of 32 for the long spring only, and a spring rate of 62 when both springs are acting together. Remember, the slope of the single spring system within the shock was 36 grams per millimeter. And when we measured the spring only, it came out to be 32, which I'd say is pretty close. When we added the two springs together, which is what's happening at the beginning of the stroke, we get 62, which is exactly the same as the measured slope. I'd say this all checks out. Two springs are stiffer than one spring, even though they are pushing against each other in opposite directions. And the single spring is softer. With two springs preloaded against each other, and if one goes slack at some point in the shock travel, as is the case with this, you're going to have this undesirable elbow. And there's no way to correct that or even soften it. If you put a softer spring here, then the slope of the first half also gets softer. It's a lose-lose proposition. There's simply no way to fix this by preload or spring rate. You've got two springs working and one spring working, and they're both going to have distinctly different stiffnesses with a sharp transition between the two. Now, I don't consider that a good thing. In fact, I'd say that the abrupt elbow, this change in spring rate, is a fatal flaw. And all negative spring shocks that I've seen will exhibit this when they are set up with both a positive and a negative spring travel. Personally, I don't want this sharp change in spring force. I want constant, smooth, predictable spring force throughout the full stroke of the shocks and the complete movement of the axles and wheels. This fatal flaw could affect performance in a couple of ways. Remember, at the full droop or full compression position, your wheels will be harder to move because of the stiffer spring zone. When the wheel has moved away from the chassis, it may suddenly drop away more quickly and unexpectedly when you pass that elbow and the spring rate drops. Depending on the terrain, it could actually be the opposite. The early spring pushes harder against the ground, then softer at the end. This means it will be harder for your wheels to return to neutral because the spring rate at the end of the articulation is lower. It's not going to have as much force pulling the wheels back into place. If you really want both bump and droop suspension, both compression and extension suspension, then we need to find more spring options. The springs should not be preloaded against each other, and that elbow should be located at your ride height. However, it's pretty tough to tell when the springs are on the inside of the shock what exactly is going on and where that transition point might be. This would be a great topic for another video. How to get smooth sprung travel in both directions without the elbow. Now, you won't hear me say this very often, but there is an advantage to an external rubber band. It doesn't go slack. Both the coil spring and the rubber bands are working with each other for the full stroke of the shock. Just remember that two springs increase the total spring rate, even if one is a compression spring and one is an extension spring. Adding a rubber band makes your overall suspension stiffer, And many drivers already have a hard time finding springs that are soft enough for their taste. And having 2 springs increases that stiffness. If you found a stiffness of 2 springs that works for you, great. Cheap hairbands also tend to lose their spring fairly quickly, and I know drivers who put on fresh bands for every drive session. Also, it's very easy to tune external bands on the fly. What I would recommend is only using 1 spring, not 2 opposing springs. This means you will lose positive bump travel in exchange for consistent spring force throughout the wheel travel. Personally, I don't worry about bump absorption at the shock. The tires are big enough and squishy enough to handle my high-speed, bumpy road shock absorbing events. Alternatively, you can just learn to adapt and drive around that abrupt elbow. Now that you know how it will react, you can anticipate and adjust your driving. Until someone comes up with a clever solution, which I am working on, you're faced with some compromises.